Bom dia, senhoras e senhores. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Senhoras e senhores. Saudamos a todos que
We
estão
would like to
presentes
greet
para a
everyone
cerimônia
who
de
is
abertura
present
do
for this
segundo
opening
Simpósio
ceremony of the
Internacional
Second International
Pan-Americano de
Symposium,
Toponímia,
Pan-American on
especialmente
Toponymy,
os convidados de honra
especially
dessa
the honored
importante
guests
sessão de
that we
abertura.
have here in this important opening session.
Topônimos ou nomes
Toponyms,
geográficos
or
são
geographical
mais do que
names,
nomes de
are
lugares em
more
mapa.
than
São
names
uma
of
forma
places and
importante de
maps. They are an
comunicação,
important means of
ligando
communication
organizações
and connect
locais,
local
nacionais e
organizations,
internacionais em
national and
todos os
international
níveis
ones,
de
and all
cooperação.
of the levels of
São também
cooperation.
informações
They're
geográficas que
also
afetam
geographical
todas as áreas da
information that affect
sociedade,
all of the areas of
alcançando e
society,
integrando elementos de
reaching and
história,
integrating elements of
geografia,
history,
cartografia,
geography,
linguagem,
cartography,
linguística,
language,
cultura,
linguistics,
tradição,
culture,
folclore,
tradition,
psicologia,
folklore,
política,
psychology,
indicações
politics,
geográficas,
geographical
serviços cadastrais
indications,
e de registro de pessoas, entre
registers,
outros.
services of
A
peoples, among
toponímia
others.
pode conectar o
Toponymy
homem
can
e a
connect
terra,
men and
carregando
earth
forte significado cultural.
with a
O
strong
objetivo
significance.
geral do
The main
Sipat
purpose
2021
of
é
Sipat
reunir
2021
pesquisadores,
is to gather
técnicos e
researchers,
usuários das mais
technicians,
diversas
and
áreas de
users of the
conhecimento
several
do
areas of
Brasil, das
knowledge of
Américas
Brazil,
e
the
globalmente
Americas, and
também,
globally as well,
para ter uma visão
to have
interdisciplinar
an
sobre
interdisciplinary
toponímia
view
ou nomes
about
geográficos,
toponymy or
visando a
geographical
troca de
names in
experiências,
order to exchange
pesquisas e
experiences,
questionamentos
research, and
em todas as suas áreas
questionings
de
in
aplicação.
all of the
Constitui-se,
areas.
assim, uma oportunidade
So then
ímpar
we
de
have
troca de
a unique
informações,
opportunity to
experiências
exchange
e
information,
questões entre
experiences, and
pesquisadores,
matters
contribuindo para
among
a
researchers,
disseminação
contributing
desse
to
campo tão
promote
relevante no
this
contexto
field that is so
geográfico
relevant
e
in
nos
the geographical
demais meios de
context and in
relação.
others related to them.
Tenho a imensa
I
satisfação,
have the
neste
great
momento,
satisfaction at this
de
time
apresentar os
to
convidados de honra
introduce
da
the
cerimônia
honored
de
guests
abertura
of
do
the
segundo
opening
Sipat.
ceremony of the second
Cientistas
Sipat,
renomados na área de toponímia no
renowned
Brasil e no
scientists on
mundo.
the toponymy area
Em
in
nome
Brazil and in
dos
the world.
comitês científicos
And on
e
behalf of the
organizadores do
scientific
segundo Sipat,
committees of
a
the
minha
second
palavra de
Sipat,
gratidão a
my
todos
word
por
of
terem
gratitude
aceito o
for
nosso
all of
convite.
you for having accepted
Gostaria
my
então de
invitation.
compor
So then I
a
would like
mesa
to have
da
this
cerimônia de
first
abertura
panel for this opening
pelo
ceremony
senhor
and
Cláudio
start with
Steiner,
Mr. Claudio Steiner,
diretor de
a
Geociências do
director of
Instituto Brasileiro
Geosciences
de
of the Brazilian
Geografia e
Institute of
Estatística,
Geography and Statistics.
o engenheiro Hélio
Is
Gouveia Prado,
Hélio
presidente
Gouveia
da
Prado,
Sociedade
engineer,
Brasileira de
president of the Brazilian
Cartografia,
Society of
SBC,
Cartography, SBC,
doutora Ellen Kerfoot,
Dr. Alan Kerfoot,
honorary chair
honorary
da
chair
United Nations
of the
Group
United
of
Nations Group of Experts on Geographical
Names,
Names, UNGAGN.
professor Dr.
Professor
Jerry
Dr.
O'Reilly,
Jerry
da Dublin City
O'Reilly from the
University,
Dublin City
Irlanda,
University in
e
London,
vice-presidente
and Vice
da
President of
European
European
Association
Association
of
of
Geographers,
Geographers,
Dr. Peter Jordan,
Dr. Peter
da
Jordan
Academia Austríaca
of
de
the
Ciências
Austrian
da
Academy of
Rua e Dario,
Sciences,
chair por parte da
Chair
ICA, na Comissão
of
Conjunta
ICA
ICA-UGI
and
em Toponímia.
ICA-UJ in Toponymy.
Vou proferir agora algumas
And so now I will say a few words
bem-vindos para todos
of welcome to all of you as participants of this symposium.
Prezados convidados,
Dear
colegas e
guests,
participantes do
colleagues,
segundo
and participants of the
Simpósio
Second International
Após algum
Pan-American
tempo,
Symposium
a
Toponymy.
segunda
After
edição
a
do
while, the
Sipat,
second
Simpósio Internacional
edition
Pan-Americano de
of
Toponímia,
this
é
symposium
finalmente
is
uma realidade.
finally a reality.
A primeira edição foi
The first
realizada em maio de
edition was in May
2017, presencialmente,
2017 in
nas dependências
presence,
da
in
Universidade
person,
Federal do Rio
in
de
the Federal
Janeiro,
University of Rio
com as
de Janeiro,
parcerias do
with
IBGE,
partners of
da
PDG,
UGI e da ICA.
UGI, and ICA.
Foi evento pequeno,
It was
com
a small
78
event with
participantes
78
e apresentação de
participants
24
and the
trabalhos
presentation
e
of
6
24
palestras
works and
especiais.
6 special
Esta versão
keynote
deveria ter
lectures.
sido
This
realizada
version
em
should have been
2019,
done in
mas por motivos de
2019,
força maior teve
but
que ser
because
postergada para
of the reasons
2020,
that
sendo então
everyone
surpreendida pela
know,
pandemia do
it had to
Covid-19.
be in 2020, but it was
Assim,
surprised by the
com o
pandemic.
apoio do Instituto
So with the
Brasileiro de
support of the
Geografia e
Brazilian
Estatística,
Institute of
IBGE,
Geography and
do
Statistics, Statistics, IBG, and of the National Council on Scientific Development, CNPq, and the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, by means of its postgraduate program in geography, a PGG e UFRJ, and GeoCart, a cartography lab from the Geography Department of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, with the support of the United Nations of the Group of Experts on Geographical Name, UGEGN, and by the Pan-American Institute of Geography and History, PGH, and by the International Geographic Union and also the International Cartographic Association, ICA, by means of its joint commission UGI, ACI, in Toponymy. We are then having our second Sipat, the result of a great dedication and the will of having an event with the integrative and multidisciplinary characteristics that already configure it the trademark of Sipat. Nowadays, the geographical names take up a high level of importance in practically all the areas of knowledge, and it's one of the most used ways to access this geographical space in relation to real world, analogic or digital. In addition, it provides a geolocation structure that is indispensable for any information system that is spatially organized, and it allows for the integration and interoperability between the groups of digital data, constituting a powerful tool to make decisions in all levels for politicians and managers, either from the private sector or from the government. So we can say how strange it can be the lack of knowledge of the impact of the geographical names in the society as a whole in all levels of public administration or private administration, as well as local, regional, or international. How to see the troubles of the changes in the name of a city. In particular, I am from the city of Rio de Janeiro originally, but I also was from the federal district, from the state of Guanabara, and now from the state of Rio de Janeiro. How many documents must be altered or updated, and what are their impacts that result in public finances? The age of naming is inherent to human activity. We name human beings as well as places, and we allow for the individualization and the consequent identification of everyone. So what comes with this act of naming, either cultural, or linguistic, political, or other charges, are a motivation for the development of research. All of this toponymic universe will be discussed in these next 3 days. So please participate and follow the works and lectures that we have in our schedule. Question, ask, and discuss the concepts and the themes presented here. Enjoy the presence of the researchers, the renowned researchers that are with us, and expand your networks. We are sure that at the end of this event, we will want to have the next one. Let us see a little bit of the current figures of Sipat. We had 270 people registered, 14 special lectures who were invited, 33 scientific reports that have expanded summaries and other works, participants from all of the Brazilian states and of our capital, the federal district, participants from the following countries: South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, of course, Canada, Spain, the United States, Holland, Indonesia, Italy, Mexico, Mozambique, Peru, Portugal, and Venezuela. In addition to the areas of knowledge, until this day, at least 21 areas were informed by the ones registered in the event: geography, history, linguistics, architecture and urbanism, education, computer sciences, oceanography, archaeology, environmental engineering, botany, medicine, accounting, languages, languages, bibliotechonomy, biology, information technology, cartographic engineering, transport engineering, social services, ecology, urban planning. And that clearly shows the multidisciplinary nature that involves the toponymic research. Finally, a few thanks must be mandatorily made at this time, in addition to all of those that we have already done at the start of my talk. To our professors and students who are volunteers who do not show up, but who are essential for the well of our symposium. But I have to make special thanks, very special thanks to Dr. Raquel Desdeira Souto, our General Secretary, for this event, for all of her work, dedication, without which, for sure, this event would not shine as much, would not sparkle as much. He also thank Evan Trace for the professionalism in its work and the development of the platform of the event, as well as the company Oriente-se Produções for the support in the language and the simultaneous translation English-Portuguese and Portuguese-English in the special sessions of the event. I would also like to thank once again the presence of our audience following us, even from their own homes. We will be together in this meeting. So enjoy the event. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Dr. Cláudio Steiner, the Director of Geosciences from the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, IBGE. Thank you very much, Paulo. I'm very honored and happy to participate here on behalf of IBGE to support this event. I think geographical names are crucial in the contemporary society. And if we think about a society that a few years back was a society that had less mobility in the territory, we can think that the weight of the geographical name had a predominant sense of belonging, of the identity of that area, of places of birth, of neighboring cities in which that population lived. As the society becomes more connected and it moves around the territory, the geographical name gains a more weight from the point of view of the economy and the appropriation of new territories. And the economy, as we know today, services like Uber, iFood, and others, they depend on the existence of geographical names that are organized. And this, thinking about a country and also internationally, geographical names, of course, are associated with power. Of course, the countries dispute the names of seas, the Sea of China and of Japan, of islands, the Falklands or the Malvina Islands, or a certain people, when they conquer another territory, the names change. For example, we have Tenochtitlan that became the city of Mexico. So this relationship of the geographical name with power and appropriation is very strong, is very important, and is more and more relevant in the society in which we live, precisely because of this higher circulation of people globally in the countries. And well, to connect with the mission of IBGE, of my institute, I think this is essential for IBGE to improve more and more the identification of the geographical names in the Brazilian territory. And this, let's say, infrastructure of information to promote that to the society, to have better cultural knowledge and economical development of the society in Brazil. So thinking about this mission of IBGE, we have, I think, the intent and to improve the access of the user to geographical names by means of interfaces that facilitate this process, and also to improve the identification of these geographical names. We will have an opportunity over the next few years, which will have a census, and will involve millions and millions of names and places that will be given by people, the dwellers of the places, and that will be the opportunity to improve the group of geographical names that are available for the Brazilian society based on that information. And I'd like to then wish a great event to all and success for this symposium that is so important for the country and for the Americas. Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Cláudio, por suas
Thank you very much,
palavras.
Claudio, for your
Passo a
words.
palavra agora
I now pass the
para o
floor
engenheiro Hélio Gouveia
to
Prado,
the
presidente da
engineer Hélio
Sociedade
Gouveia
Brasileira de
Prado, the
Cartografia.
president of the Brazilian Society of Cartography. It's better if I open my microphone, right? So good day to you all. First of all, I'd like to greet the organizers of the second symposium, second Sipat, as well as the society organizes several events, and Professor Paulo was our vice president as well. We know how problematic and how much work is involved in individual jobs in the organizers. And the Brazilian Society of Cartography is honored with the invitation to participate in this event as a society, and I in particular, precisely because I am a cartographic engineer and I work in cartography. I've been working for more than 20 years now in that area. I know geographical names a lot. First of all, I'd like to make a brief oral presentation of my society. The Brazilian Society of Cartography is, as our statute says, a civil association in technical scientific nature with the finality, with the purpose to enhance the progress of cartographic sciences, geodesic sciences, and remote sensing. Having said that, I'd also like to mention a definition that I enjoy very much of cartography, which is an ancient definition. It's an old definition from the UNESCO, and I will read here that cartography is a group of scientific studies and operations that are technical and artistic in nature, based on the results of direct observation or the analysis of documentation. They have to do with the elaboration of maps, charts, and other means of expressing and representing objects and elements, phenomenon, and physical and social economic environments, as well as its use. And in this use, I cite the importance of toponymy. As Professor Paulo very well put it, they are the names of the cartographic elements or the geographical names or toponyms. And toponymy, I understand that it basically would tend to individualize these elements when we put names in a few things. In that universe that we have, our work universe, we want to individualize that element in its own universe. But we know that this individualization does not happen. That's why we need to have a scientific treatment of this situation. And I say a scientific treatment, as I said, because I work on the area of the production of cartography and generation of information. I've been doing that for a long time now. I will mention, for example, an example of limits. Territorial limits. They can be borders, they can be limits between institutions or between private entities. A limit is defined by a legal instrument, and this legal instrument can be a treaty, it can be a law, it can be a decree, or a scripture, or even a sentence. And when all else fails, we go to the legal realm. And these limits established in these legal documents, they can be natural limits or geometric or artificial limits. The natural ones tend always to be based on toponymy. You have then a limit done by a river and you cite the name of that river until a certain accident. Normally, after this accident, you continue with another natural limit, or based on that place, after that place, you start with an artificial limit. And the matter of toponymy has a great interest because when you define, for example, the name of a river, this river will be the limit between two independent states. This river can also have a name for a state, and the same river can have another name for another state. In the case of our Brazilian borders, we have a few cases like this. And another matter that we have, it has to do with the duplicity, not only of the same name or two different names for the same element or the same name for several elements. The IBGE has, let's say, a division. It has a structure, a framework for territorial areas, and it studies these intermunicipality borders and interstate borders and limits, as we're saying. And normally, and often they deal with this matter. So we also have not only the matter of the duplicity, but we also have the imprecision. We can get to a geographical name thinking that that name is accurate, and in the region, in the area itself, the same geographical accident has several names within the same state, within the same people, and in the same country. And lastly, as was already mentioned here, it's changed over time because geographical names change over time. And this also in the matter of limits and borders, I'm focusing here on this matter because this always brings a concern for independent states. These changes of geographical names, when they are cited in a situation of delimitation between two states, that's a matter that can generate a certain trauma or tension between two peoples. So with this quick overview, I wanted to show the importance of a serious and scientific study of toponymy, of geographical names, and everything that involves this. I'd also like to wish everyone a wonderful conference and that we may have a lot of good results for our work. A good day to everyone. Thank you very much, Gouveia, for your words. I'd like to now pass the floor to Dr. Helen Kerfoot, Honorary Chair of the United Nations Group of Experts on Geographical Names. Helen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paolo. I hope everybody can hear me. First, thank you, Paolo, and members of the conference organizing committee, the local support team, and all who've been involved with organizing this conference amidst the difficulties of COVID. I know arranging a virtual conference is time-consuming and poses many questions not experienced in a person-to-person gathering. So a big thank you from all of us. Next, as Honorary Chair of the United Nations Group of Experts on Geographical Names, or UNGEGN, I would like to welcome all those making presentations or linking into the conference. UNGEGN was created by a decision of the UN Economic and Social Council and met for the first time in 1960. Since then, through conferences and sessions, efforts have been made for every country to have a national authority responsible for the written forms of its geographical names. Over the 60 years, progress has been made by providing guidelines and advice through publications and training courses, by establishing scientific romanization systems, and by giving leadership in database development. At the outset of our work, technical aspects related to georeference systems and the demands of mapping were paramount, but gradually the cultural aspect of toponyms in relation to language, history, and identity has gained significance. However, today, much work still remains for each country to have authorized geographical names that are widely available. And it's occasions like this conference that provide incentive, scientific advice, and most valuable reference material for those in toponymic administration. It's here that presentations and discussions take place on the toponymic issues of the day. And Angegen is currently considering the relationship of geographical names to the environment and to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also the impact of principles of equality on naming practices. And as a Canadian, I'm very aware of the increased interest in toponymy of Indigenous peoples, particularly in regard to their languages, cultures, and rights. A number of papers being presented this week will be of direct interest and benefit to those striving in their own countries to establish principles and procedures of geographical naming that appropriately address the societal issues of today. So I think all of you, and I thank all of you who have spent time with your research and developing your papers. And I certainly wish everybody a great experience and a very successful and profitable conference. So thank you. Obrigada, gracias. Thank you, Paula.
And now I'd like to invite Professor Dr. Cosimo from the Universidade de Roma, who is the chair by the International Geographic Union of the Joint Commission ICA-UGI in Toponymy. Cosimo, you have the floor. And now I'd like to invite Professor Dr. Jerry from Dublin City University in Ireland, Vice Chair of ERGO, the European Association of Geographers. And Professor Jerry will give a presentation on his work on toponymy within our opening session. Jerry, you have the floor.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. I'll just open up the presentation here. And right, I feel more reassured now that it has popped up. Well, thank you once again to Paulo and the organizing team, and thank you for inviting me. Today, I'm going to look at place naming and identities and geography, critical perspectives in a globalizing and standardizing world. You could say that's a huge agenda, especially with such an expert group of people around me. And I would not say I'm an expert yet in the area. So I will take an approach of looking at what is going on, as I perceived out there, in the whole world of naming and toponymy, and I'll explain that later on. I am Vice President of Eurogeo and in the Department of Geography, School of History and Geography in Dublin City University. So then, looking at toponymy and hydronymy in 2021, there is a renewed critical interest, I would argue. So, with location and cartographical aspects, etymology, geohistories were very salient in past studies, and they're now being enhanced from a range of radical perspectives, especially in a globalizing, standardizing world with Googleization and the consequent normalization of place names, perceptions, and images worldwide, including those for marketing purposes. However, there remain conflicting and contesting voices, and rightly so. So, the idea of a project on geographical naming on land and sea was proposed to me by Eurogeo, the European Association of Geographers, and also Springer International publications that work with Eurogeo. And the idea was to look at the theories, concepts, and case studies and educational approaches in relation to toponymy. Therefore, I said, how will I do this? Where does one start? So the work is very interdisciplinary, with authors from all regions, national and international toponymy-related institutions and organizations, including the GIGN and International Geographical Union, the International Cartographic Association, and so forth. So some of the keywords I'll be using today are naming, place, critical perspectives, standardizing, contesting voices, and education, which is a very important one in the research. Now, this research on toponymy really is the third in a series of books that I have been working on. The idea behind the books in Eurogeo, in collaboration with Springer, is to take important aspects of geography that are very, very much related to the everyday and sometimes not quite obvious for students and trainers of students. Therefore, my task was to prepare material appropriate for third level students, but more so for the trainers of trainers and teachers. So by taking in the first area, my specialist area is geopolitics, but looking at that in perspective to humanitarian action and geography in times of conflict, whereby students and people are constantly exposed to it every day in the news and with social media. Then also then, when that was completed, looking at spaces of memory and legacies in an age of insecurities and globalization. So that brought me into research the geopolitics and geographies of emotions. And we saw this particularly in the last 10 years. So looking at the geographies of emotions, what really shapes people's attitudes, and in particular, the general public and everyday events. So in that context, my third attempt here is with toponymy. So, as aforementioned, this toponymy book explores multiple contemporary and applied aspects of geopolitics, as well as the geopolitics of emotions in transition. The trajectory then from the conceptual to the actual production of this toponymy book project. The presentation then of information regarding this trajectory will be looked at today with reference to chapters, writers, and their research before opening the floor for questions and answers. And the approach I took was I invited people directly, and the response was overwhelming. And I left the content quite open to the interpretation of the invitees, so that I could get a larger picture of perceptions and what is actually going on in many countries and internationally in relation to toponymy. I had 55 responses. Sorry, I had 65 responses, and 50 of them are suitable for the specific book project. So I was amazed by the response and the interest of people to it. And it wasn't just within my own colleagues at work or in relation to Eurogeo, but from a very, very broad spectrum of people. So, reading between the lines then, from the different responses from the people who answered my call, what are the key ideas that are coming through? Geopolitics, territorialization, lessons of history and geohistory, recurring nationalism, the UN involvement, and a sub-theme of a multilateral approach versus a unilateral approach towards in that whole nexus of culture, history, geography, as made reference to by the previous speakers. But very often the state paradigm comes in, and its approach to the boundaries, not alone territorial, but more and more so, as we're witnessing, particularly in Southeast Asia, in relation to the seas. And of course, its relevance for the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But in all that, when you look at the different types of naming, top down, bottom up, and how toponymy is used, much of it relates back to the geopolitics of emotions and recent histories. As was mentioned by Helen, of course this has a strong significance with the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of them I've been particularly exploring is SDG number 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions with the Rule of Law. But of course, the research in toponymy, the great research which many people here today have been carrying out, relates very, very much so to a positive geopolitics of peace building. And I strongly believe the work that you are carrying out contributes to such. So thank you to all those people involved in this book project, and there are several of them following today. So I didn't know exactly how to present this slide, but it's to say a big thank you. So 30 chapters are in progress with over 50 writers, perspectives from all continents, with a very large diversity of authors and standpoints. Also, as Paulo indicated earlier on, it is very multidisciplinary, but also being a native English speaker, I'm very aware of the importance of other languages, because sometimes English-speaking people who have such an impact at a global level in international organizations and, how would you say, production of material on toponymy, sometimes the English-speaking people need to be reminded of the importance of other languages within that. Also, a lot of the material that people are using on this book project, it's from original sources and archives, as with the colleagues in Ljubljana, in Sarajevo, and in Brazil, and other examples. And I'm most pleased that Eurogeo and Springer have backed the production of this book project, and that it will have an effect on third level higher end students, but more so on the training of trainers who will be dealing with education and projects in many of these countries. Hence, the book research aims, well, to deconstruct the nexus between theory, concepts, place, space, endonym, exonym, toponymy, which you're all very, very familiar with. But to explore the significance of toponymy in everyday life for ordinary people, and the managerial political sphere, of course, to elucidate the role of the stakeholders in place naming, top down and bottom up. Therefore, identity, grassroots, culture, populace, public, and NGOs, how they use it, as with local development groups. Therefore, the government organizations and international government organizations, UNESCO, again, Council of Europe, EU, and other institutions, but also within that more and more I found, as I was discussing the ideas with the chapter writers, the whole colonial, neo-colonial heritages, and not just within the global South, because very many people, I believe, think of whom speak of colonial heritage, they're only speaking of the global South, whereas in fact, it is very, very relevant in different ways to the global North. That is, looking at these naming situations within and between states. And then the final aim, to communicate with wider audiences beyond the academic, disciplinary, language methodological, and the proverbial echo chambers. So I feel with the great response I had that people from many different organizations or associations are communicating very much so in this project. Now, moving on to the next slide. Toponymy and the geopolitics of emotions is a phrase, an idea which I've developed, which I have borrowed from Dominique Moisy, and I like his works very, very much. That sometimes in our very logical frameworks as academics and researchers, sometimes we underestimate the force of emotions, and particularly now in a world with social media just beyond the national boundaries, whereby place naming and associated ideas can have a profound emotional effect on people, but also their reactions. Therefore, with place naming, perception, how it's used, interpreted and reinterpreted, forgotten, hidden, or cut out of the map and the narrative, literally. The power of the control of place and naming. So we go there into very much the Foucauldian concepts of power, powerful, but instead of just seeing that as negative, they hold a powerful potential for consensus building and education if used for ethical purposes, as opposed to negative ends, whether they be territorial and power paradigms, which can nourish populism. Place, name, and memory. There are psychosocial associations, whether that be joy, nostalgia, but also of conscience and shame. And this is, again, recognized by UNESCO and other international institutions and organizations. The psychogeographies and histories then are important. I put the call out for collaborators and writers, and it was very, very short on purpose in order to see the different interests of the responses. And from some keyword analysis then, excuse me, I then tried to break the different proposals into blocks. And for example, what determined part one of the book? From keyword analysis, the word perception, reoccurrence of that word, then neo-toponymy. Other proposals that very much emphasized the divide between endonym and exonyms, the challenges then that were brought out, but also other words like commemorative and very much so the word scale. And examples of those came through in the chapter proposals from Korea, France, Argentina, Slovenia, and Spain. The authors emphasize the physicality of the places, but also the symbolism and the active usage by the stakeholders, but also how that can be manipulated for positive or negative reasons. Therefore, the research and resultant book had its objectives and its outcomes, as I mentioned, the nexus and concepts, continuity and change for each generation, material and existential, reasons for conflict regarding toponymy, and the importance of consensus. Analyzed by 50 authors and the project, diverse standpoints, research sources in original language, for example, Greek, Turkish, Bosnian, Portuguese, Spanish, German, which very much enhances the approach, and the range of ideas supported by the project from Eurogeo and Springer. Now, in part one, as the chapters found their niche, you have the challenging conceptual theoretical approaches to place naming. For example, the validity of critical toponymy perspectives for an understanding of human perception on place, from Sun-Jae Cho from Korea, who also works with you in the special committees at the UN. The place naming and neo-toponymy, a French experience through the lens of a theoretical framework by Frédéric Giraud, our colleague in Geneva. The endonym-exonym divide, Peter Jordan and Kohei Watabe. Geographical names in Argentina. Commemorative place naming to claim the past to repair futures by Derek Alderman in Texas. And a very, very interesting approach there from Derek in looking at street naming and such place naming in Paris, where the feminist movement a few years ago looked at street names and then wrote down women's names rather than men after doing the statistical analysis at the complete underrepresentation of female names in places in street naming and place naming in Paris, but also then looking at the BLM in Black Lives Matter movement, and the whole debate on place naming in the USA, particularly in the last 2 years. Toponymy and the change of scale very much so analyzes the concept of scale, and its importance, but the areas that are fluid between the different scales as used in Spain. The difference between a very legalistic national authority and the struggle to avoid conflict, but also democratically work with regional and local authorities in the place naming. The second natural coming together of ideas and bouncing one another came from my friend Vladimir Kolosov and the Russian School of Place Naming, and most interesting to see the work of the Academy of Science and Place Naming in Russia and the great period of transitions there in the last 30 years. Then from the colleagues in Slovenia, a standardization of geographical names on land and sea, and again in its state building in Slovenia and standardization, Trojan work is going on, and I very, very much learned a lot from Drago and Macka there. Another paper that came in that I was fascinated by was the place of the New Zealand Geographic Board in advancing the cultural politics of place naming, and of course the approach towards bilingualism in some places and the very positive steps being taken in recognition of the Maori culture and people, Conflict and challenges in standardization of geographical names in Spain looks very much, looks at the top-down approach. He works at the ministry responsible for toponymy and all the legal side, which I found fascinating because of the differences in national approaches, but also their legal systems in implementing legislation in relation to place naming. Another interesting one that stood out was major development projects and place naming issues in Saudi Arabia. Ali Al-Dorsi looked at the idea of places being developed now into large tourism or project sites, and the whole issue of place names being imposed on them from the top for commercial and some political, mostly commercial importance, but a certain backlash or reluctance on the part of local people. Also, urban toponymy is looked at. So just a summary then of the main words coming out in part 2. As I mentioned, Russian School of Place Name, very, very legalistic and clear in what is legal and non-legal, but the realities on the ground need to be further explored. Standardization of naming in Slovenia, and of course with its neighbors, including Austria. The New Zealand Geographic Board advancing the cultural politics of place naming. Standardization in Spain, Saudi Arabia, and toponymy in Turkey, which has a very interesting history in toponymy, but particularly at the moment under the Erdogan regime. The third block that came out in the natural evolution was cultural crossroads and toponymy, place naming, and a case study of Bosnia-Herzegovina with colleagues from the area and also an input from Marko Krebs from Ljubljana, who works with them. And a very interesting approach with recreating the future modern housing estates and existing toponyms in Sarajevo. Now, Elsa and her colleague are from the Faculty of Architecture in Sarajevo, and it's most interesting to see many of the dilemmas that the architects face in relation to place naming. The geohistory of the Mohacs Plain is explored, and of course, Hungary being a crossroads for languages and cultures, and at the same time having a very, very strong toponymic cultural historical base. Theorizing multiple or plural place names in Southern Africa is explored by Tendai Magena, and most interesting again to see various local approaches historically, and of course the whole story of the colonial imposition of naming. Then there is also the whole narrative of Catalonia and how the bilingualism is now legal there, but also part of school curricula and so forth, and how this is impacting on changing names within Catalonia. Street naming in Malta provides a very rich text not alone for Malta as a unique place, but also emblematic of many parts of the Mediterranean and the world. And then perspectives from Brazil on the Lusitania maps and their use in toponymy, presented by Paulo and Menez and his colleagues. So in summary then, cultural crossroads in Bosnia-Herzegovina, modern housing estates, geohistory of naming in sensitive areas such as the Mohacs Plain in Hungary, and particularly the regime in power in Hungary at the moment. It has a very, very, how would I say, strict policy in relation to naming or name changing. Multiple plural place names in Southern Africa, language policies in Catalonia, street naming, and then perspectives from Brazil. So you can see the richness in part two. Now, the naming of Estonian farms, I hadn't thought of it in many ways, but again, a rich area giving insights into naming places. And that is analyzed with the transition from the Soviet to the post-Soviet era and the collective farms being broken up, and then the search for names and which names are being used, pre-collectivization or variations of the collectivization names in that period. In the case study on Indonesia, it concerns the Bandung Basin in West Java, and it is taken from a strong anthropological and linguistic approach. Variations on those two I've just spoken about come into the rich historical to new place naming in the case of Italy, presented by Laura Cassi. Regarding Ireland and the toponymic landscapes, Jonathan Cherry, Brian O'Rahla, and Una Rahnach are looking at this toponymic landscape, and it's very, very rich in their approach. One, it is a mixture, that team, a mixture of academics, but also people who work for the National Naming Commission here in Dublin. And again, with Ireland's rich history of layering of cultures and languages, this can produce all sorts of collaborations and interesting insights into the political culture of the island. This is followed by translating topographies, the salience of Brian Friel's linguistic approach to landscape and toponymy regarding Ireland by Professor Charlie Travis from Texas University. The continuing with part of that theme, colonialism and the global north and linguistics and naming and so forth, Jennifer Ballantyne Pereira is looking at Gibraltar from a Gibraltarian perspective. And again, the whole interplay, intermix of political cultures. Most important then, in regarding that, we have the UN capacity building in toponymy with Virgin Helen and Pierre Giorgio, and I met two of you today for the first time, thanks to this conference, and that I found very, very interesting, and to see the very positive work being done by this group in relation to education. While it's very, very practical in the training of trainers, it also takes into account the larger vision. So it's that juxtaposition of the very practical in relation to agreement, peace building, consensus, and naming, the academic, but the greater sensitivity. Then from Israel, Talia Weissel is looking at the mystery of hydronymy on land and sea, particularly on land and sea in Israel. A similar approach is being taken by Leah Galani, who worked with me on the memory book, in relation to toponymy in Greece, but also the impact of Greek toponymy historically throughout the Mediterranean. And the final contribution will be from Prof. Ruth McManus here in Dublin, my colleague, bringing together place naming with self-directed work for groups and reflection for groups and for students and trainers in the area. Therefore, that's just a summary of what I have said there. Naming farms, the importance of anthropology, evaluating historical juxtaposed with new names, reading landscapes, translating such through the arts and emotions, decolonizing toponymy, the UN, and its very important work, hydronymy in Israel, geohistories in Greece and the Mediterranean, and then their use in education, the interplay. Overall conclusions, the nexus between those ideas I have been speaking of, the nexus is complex and messy. Place, psychology, memory, landscape, geopolitics, past, present, and future. Of course, by its very nature, it's complex and messy, and hopefully the different perspectives will enrich our understanding. Also, what came out very strongly was the habitus, the I, we live here. So the concept of habitus, which Yifutwan, I'm sure many geographers and others are aware of his work in relation to the concept of habitus, the normalization of naming, both material and the intangible, for individual and group memory, for rights, for stakeholders. Also then, as is going on at many levels, the attempted manufacture of social consent when it comes to naming, with some old and some new wine. And I use the word wine there as a metaphor in regards to finding a balance. But it can be presented in what sort of bottles? The democratic label, as promoted by the UN, or the populist appellation or other agenda. And that is what we must be very much aware of. The socio-political malaise is out there, as we are witnessing in live media daily. So we have to mind the naming and to see where it's coming from and for what reasons. Therefore, we have a strong expectation from the electorates versus what government can actually deliver. Also, many demanding renaming of places. So that must be handled in the context, or not handled, but explored when we think of the real and existentialist aspects as regards fake truths feeding into populisms, our land, our territory, our name. Who exactly? Social media is providing multiple advantages, as we know, but dangers also that can be exploited. Therefore, there is a quest to redefine workable democracy in relation to naming. And it is now going on at global levels, with one part of the world or one group influencing the perception of another. So we have this whole copycat effect, for want of a better word. The case studies we are looking at exemplify the above realities at multiple scales, but also at multiple power levels. Therefore, regarding naming, education and training is a necessity in combating ignorance, fake news, fake names and populism in order to enhance democratic ideals and workable solutions as recommended for long-term sustainable development in the SDGs. So, thank you, mille buenas and obrigada.
Thank you, Jerry. And finally, I'd like to declare open the second Sipat, the second Pan-American International Symposium on Toponymy. And I'd like to invite Dr. Peter Jordan from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, which he just pronounced in German, and I won't, and a chair from AICA and the Joint Commission from UGI ICA in Toponymy, to give his opening lecture for our second Sipat. Welcome, Peter, and feel free to begin at your convenience. And so you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I was allowed to speak 40 minutes. Is it still true? I was allowed to speak 40 minutes. Oh, thank you, thank you. So let me first of all welcome you also cordially on behalf of our commission as the ICA chair of this commission. We are happy to co-organize the symposium, and I thank the local organizers, and especially Paulo de Menezes, for all their efforts and for their great cooperation. Let me also, as a newly elected president, so may I ask for the first slide?
If you have the presentations, you can share.
Yes, but I was promised to get it handled from your side. So I will try to find it. Yes.
O cara fala inglês, doido. Porque ele é americano. Não mexe.
Can you see it? Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
So fine. So my topic is some principal thoughts on place names and place naming. And let me start with stating that name giving in general expresses responsibility. And this is very well expressed by Genesis 2:20, when it says, the man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field. And it is very well illustrated by this tapestry, Flemish tapestry, which is exposed in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence. And you can see here on the left side Adam, and he's receiving a parade of all the different kinds of animals, and he's naming the animals. So this means that the animals are entrusted to man. The person responsible for something or owning something has the right of naming usually. It is like that when parents name their children. Also, ownership would not be the correct not the correct word in this context. It is rather responsibility or entrustment in this case when parents name their children. This understanding of naming and names is certainly common to all cultures based on the Jewish Christian fundament. I don't have the expertise to judge whether this understanding is universal. But on the other hand, I don't know any culture which would not understand it in this way, naming in this way. So having started with this basic statement on naming and names in general, I would like to proceed specifically with place names and address the following items. First, the place naming process, then the rules of place names in mediating humans and geographical space, and finally, some reflections on place name standardization. So let me first turn to the place naming process. There are three factors involved into this place naming process. First of all, the local community is the center here, illustrated by this circle, in the sense of a group of people who feel to have a common identity. It can vary in size between family partnership, nation, group of citizens, language community, up to the global community. Global citizens, so to say. It needs not to be a cohesion group in the sociological sense, in the sense of a group of people tied by personal relations and almost in permanent interaction. It can also just be an identity group, in the sense of a group of people feeling to have a common identity. They need not to have personal relations, they need not to know even not to know each other. This is so, for instance, with a nation, it's a Brazilian nation, for instance, which is a community in this sense, and it's included here. The second factor, also indicated on this slide here, is the community's culture, including language, of course. Culture understood here in the most comprehensive sense as the totality of all human expressions. And the third factor, indicated by the barrow at the bottom here, is geographical space, subdivided into geographical features. Geographical space understood as a totality of all relations between material and immaterial features. The only actor in this process is the local community. It inhabits a certain section of geographical space. It has developed a certain culture, perhaps also a language of its own. It can also be part of another language, of course, and structures complex geographical space mentally into features on the background of its culture and led by its specific, for instance, economic interests, marking these features by place names. This marking is indicated by the arrows here. So at the bottom barrow, you see the different features in which a geographical space is subdivided, and every feature is named. If it's not named, it's not perceived as a feature of its own. It's part of another feature. Names for geographical features at the community's own territory may be called endonyms, in the sense of names from within the community. Endonyms in this sociological sense are symbols of appropriation or of responsibility, in the sense mentioned before. For geographic features outside its territory, a community usually just adopts already existing names. translates them into its own language, or adapts them morphologically or phonetically to makes them more handsome, so to say. In contrast to names for features on its own territory, which are endonyms, these are exonyms. These are exonyms needed by community to mark features outside its own territory, but important to this community. In a comfortable way, easy to be pronounced, to be communicated. In contrast to endonyms, exonyms are not symbols of appropriation or only of responsibility, and do not express claims, but indicate the importance of a feature for this community and the relations it has with it. Exonyms just help to integrate this foreign feature into the cultural sphere of a community and help to avoid exclusion and alienation. But it is also true that the use of exonyms is sometimes conceived as expressing claims, especially when exonyms correspond to historical endonyms. But this is a misunderstanding which should be erased, also by politically sensitive use of exonyms. Naming is done either by convention between the members of a community or by an institution charged and legitimized by the community for this purpose. Of course, also an individual can attribute a name to a feature, but such a name will not get into use, assume communicative value, and persist if it is not accepted by the community. Only if it is accepted by other members of the same community, it gets communicative value, of course, and it will persist. So it is always, at the end, the community who acts in this process. It's the only actor in this process. No community, however, is completely homogeneous. It is always composed of a dominant portion and a non-dominant subgroups. The dominant portion of the community is, of course, in the position to decree the use of a name, to make other people obliged to use this name, whether they like it or not. It is also true that we have always multiple identities. We are not belonging only to one community, but rather to a multitude of them. We have, in fact, multiple group identities, also space-related identities. These various communities have usually also different relations to space, feel responsible for different sections of spatial reality. We are global citizens, as you can see here on the top. If we engage ourselves for questions like climate change, for instance, or global disparities in development and so on. Global institutions and organizations like the United Nations, for instance, are supporting this community, this global community, or this feeling to be a global community. We are, at the same time, inhabitants of our continent, as far as we feel responsible and engage ourselves for this continent. We are at the same time citizens of an association of countries, like the European Union, for instance. We are members of a language community, like, for instance, the Portuguese community. We are members of a nation. We are citizens of a country. We are inhabitants of a region, of a city, of a commune, of a village, for instance. And almost all these communities are in a way organized and feel a responsibility for a certain section of space. And all of these mentioned have certainly a specific relation to space. But there may also be communities with the same relation to space inhabiting the same section of space. So different just by cultural characteristics, inhabiting the same space, the same section of realities, the same section of space, but different by ethnicity, by language, by religion, and so on. Like it is in minority situations, when a given territory is settled not only by one, but by several communities. All these communities are also active in naming, but they can attribute endonyms in the sense of names from within, only to geographical features at their very own level, at their very own scale. Since the competence for attributing a name, for applying the endonym, is regulated by the principle of subsidiarity. it is always a smaller community, the community closer to the feature and actually responsible for this feature, who has the primary right to attribute a name. Thus, for instance, the name for the Earth is certainly an endonym in all languages spoken on Earth, because we are all Earthlings, we are all inhabitants of the Earth. It's the endonym in all the languages. Names for individual features on Earth are, however, not anymore endonyms in all languages, even if we all feel to be global citizens. Thus, the name for a certain country is certainly an endonym in the language of all communities forming the permanent population of it, while not all the names in the languages of non-dominant communities for the capital of this country will be endonyms, because not all of them will be well established in this capital. These communities, not all of them will be well established in this capital. This principle of subsidiarity is also valid within a certain language, not only between languages, but also within a certain language. So not only when communities with different languages are involved. It occurs frequently that the local population calls a village differently from outsiders, speaking the same language. Based on this concept, I would define the endonym as the name accepted and used by the local community, and the exonym as the name not used by the local community. It is very true that these definitions differ from ENG's definitions as well as from ICO's definitions, but these are the definitions we arrived at the end of our discussion in our ENG working group on exonyms. And just the political veto at the end prevented passing these definitions. So this was our general opinion in the working group on exonyms up to the end, up to the very end. Thus the endonym, and according to these definitions, the endonym-exonym divide corresponds exactly to the divide between space and place in the sense of Vier-Foot-One, quoted earlier by Jerry. This means the divide between neutral space and this section of space to which a certain human community has assumed relations, place. So if I have an endonym for a certain section of space, it becomes place for me. It turns from space, from neutral space into place. This divide also corresponds to the basic human attitude of discerning between mine and yours, between ours and theirs, and to the other basic human attitude of territoriality, the desire to own a place, which exists at all levels of human community building. This divide is also transferable to other name categories, like ethnonyms, names of peoples, of nations, for instance, names of institutions. This means to everything where an inside as well as an external view is relevant. In all these cases, we have an name from the inside, from insiders, used by insiders, and the name used by outsiders, the endonym and the exonym. So it is really a basic onomastic concept, this divide between endonym and exonym. Now let me turn to the second part of my presentation, the roles of place names in mediating humans and geographical space. I think that place names can have four main functions in relating humans to geographical space. This is not true for all place names. They can have this function. First of all, they often reflect characteristics of space important for a certain community. So they often describe location, morphology, waters, vegetation, soils of a certain place, or functions of a place within geographical space, like the bridge function, port function, pass function, market function, and so on. They highlight in this way characteristics that seemed important to the people who named the place, on the background of their culture and their specific interests. Farmers had naming motives different from herdsmen. Seafarers had different naming motives from mountain dwellers. We, the people living today, have naming motives different from our ancestors. For us, the meaning of a name can have lost its transparency. For instance, when the name originates from a language spoken earlier and not anymore at this same place. The meaning attributed to the feature and expressed may have lost its importance for us, since our culture and interests are different from the culture when the feature was named, or by which the feature was named. But it can be assumed that no name was meaningless for the people who were the first to apply it. I think there's no case where just a name was given without any meaning. So place names reflect the perception of space by a certain community and are condensed narratives into two directions about the feature named and about the cultural disposition of the name-giving community. Then a second role is place names mark the territory of a community. Place names are, among other symbols, markers of a group's own territory. I must not enlarge on this role here, since I have discussed it already in the context of the naming process. Just an illustration here. The territory is marked by a signpost. It's a boundary of the Austrian province of Styria, which is marked by signposts of this kind, showing all the exonyms of the place of the province. It's a rather exceptional way of marking a territory. It's also not the usual case in Austria. It's just very exceptional and remarkable, perhaps. Let me turn to the third role. Place names structure space mentally. Place names structure space mentally. They help to subdivide complex spatial reality into features. Every geographical feature, in the sense of a subunit of geographical space, is a mental construct. This is especially obvious with landscapes, cultural regions, or macroregions, lacking concrete or clear limits like current administrative boundaries, natural natural boundaries like mountain ranges or rivers. For instance, Europe or the macroregions of Europe are obviously just a scientific construct. So they are mental constructs, and cannot be proved by empirical evidence, so to say. It's impossible to find clear boundaries for Central Europe, for instance, or for Southeast Europe in reality. A place name is the vehicle, the instrument in this process of mental structuring of space. Without place names, we would not be able to establish a system of space-related identities, to communicate this system, and to maintain it. In many cases, like it is with cultural regions or with landscapes, the place name is in fact the only identifier of a geographical feature. Nothing else hints at this identity and at this feature, so to say. It's more or less just the place name. And the section of space without a name is obviously not conceived as a feature in its own right, just as a part of another feature. Let me turn to the fourth role, the last role. Place names support emotional ties between humans and place and promote in this way space-related identity building. Place names, if somebody acquainted with a place reads, mentions, or memorizes a place name, this recalls all the contents of the space-related concept with him or with her, reminds him of sights, persons, smells, sounds, and events associated with this place, and lets the feel of a place arise, as Yifu Duan calls it. Therefore, it is, for instance, very important for minorities to have their place names represented in public space, as it is here on this slide with a place in Italy, nearby Trieste. They give these communities a feeling of belonging, of being at home there. It is also kind of an affirmative action, since non-dominant groups are in special need of being affirmed. For them, group identity, including space-related identity, is a prominent part of it. As a prominent part of it means a daily challenge, much more than for a dominant group. The main task of minority place names on signposts is not information, assuming that somebody could not be able to read the name in the dominant language, but symbolic representation of the minority. This is the main task. The minority is to be affirmed that it is also their place. The minority has a share in its identity, in the place's identity. Therefore, it is also important that on the signpost figures the endonym as it is used and written by the minority group. The Ukrainian name in Cyrillic letters in this Romanian case. So here's an example from the northeastern part of Romania, where a Ukrainian minority writing in Cyrillic script exists, and there is the Cyrillic name is represented as a minority name on the town sign here. How important place names are for identity and emotional ties can be also seen from immigrants to overseas, for instance, who frequently take the name of their home place with them as a last tie to their former home, or to make the new place more familiar. New Amsterdam, New York are prominent examples, but also, for instance, Breslau in the surroundings of Kitchener in Western Ontario and Canada. So obviously immigrants from what was earlier Breslau in Poland, today it is Wrocław, named their new place in Canada after their place of origin. So maintaining a tie to the place of origin, so to say, and perhaps making the new place more familiar to them. Or as Cosimo Balaciano has investigated, the Italian names transferred from Italy to Latin America. This is a map from his contribution to a recent book, showing all the places which are named after Italian names by migrants, by immigrants to overseas. Finally, if I have still time enough, I will reflect a little bit on place name standardization. As it is conducted by UNGEGN, the United Nations group of experts on geographical names, represented by Helen Kerfoot in this symposium, at the global level and by national and subnational place names authorities on the country level. And you can see by this example here how necessary it is to standardize. This is a picture or a combination of pictures from my hometown in Hermogor in Carinthia and from a village in the surrounding of it. And you can see 3 different spellings of a place name in a distance of not more than 10 meters. So these plates are in a distance of not more than 10 meters, and you can see same name written with different spellings. So grass with just one S, grass with a double S, and grass with a so-called sharp S, as it is usual still in Austrian German. So standardization is necessary. In this case, it would be very necessary, I would say. So standardization of place names means defining out of a variety of names for a certain feature the most relevant, the correct name, and to promote its use in the first line in the public sphere. The guiding principle is one name for one feature. Although this principle is not valid in the case of minority and indigenous names, and with a certain caveat also with excellence. This is done to achieve the following goals: to achieve unambiguity, which can be essential for the identification of a location, very important in emergency situations, for instance. It has the goal of achieving, more generally speaking, clarity and reliability, as it is useful also in other fields when procedures are based on rules and on scientific findings, and to preserve and protect traditional names against unfounded changes and commercialization, as it is frequently the case in our times. It is also used for standardization for conflict prevention, because place names, due to their symbolic power, frequently cause conflict, as already mentioned by Gary. If their use is regulated and if an international authority like ENG offers recommendations, this can contribute to avoid conflict. Standardization does not mean that all other names should fall into oblivion. They too should be preserved and documented. With our electronic means, this is easier than ever today. In any case, place names are a cultural asset, whether they are standardized or not. Every name can also be valuable for research purposes. However, standardization does mean a restriction in the practical use of names. From the goals of standardization and the efforts for these goals at all administrative levels, it can be concluded that standardization creates indeed a lot of benefits. But it is also justified to ask who benefits from standardization most, or who should benefit from it. Is it a local and regional community with a frequent use of dialect names in the vernacular language? Is it a nation, the community mostly linked by a well-codified standard language and its names? Or is it the international community whose communication is to be facilitated through standardization, then perhaps in an optimal way by the use of international names, in practice, the exonyms of a global trade language? The basic principle of standardization, the agreement on a single correct name for a geographical feature, actually requires a decision between these options, because it cannot meet all these requirements at the same time. The question, however, refers not just to the spatial reference, to the scale. There are also people with different interests within these spatial categories. For instance, those who primarily value clear communication, and those who are more concerned about the preservation of place names as a part of the cultural heritage. This may create a tension. So the problem is more complex than it appears at first glance. These are also questions typical for critical toponomastics, a rather recent research current that examines the social and political background of place names, regarding also standardization as an expression of a specific naming policy and not without alternatives. In the context of the United Nations, Ingvild Nordland from Norway explicitly referred to this problem for the first time in 2019. In practice, as always with place names, it is a dominant societal force and the dominant political level in a hierarchical political system that determines the direction. Today, these are usually the nations dominating also international bodies like the United Nations, where the national level is exceptionally weak in relation to other political levels, like in Switzerland. The national interest is less able to assert itself also with place names. This political constellation means, as a rule, that place names are standardized in their respective standard language form, which means optimizing them for nationwide communication inside a certain country. Occasionally, however, also dialect names are standardized if they are well established in literature and public use and well known also in other parts of the same country. Usually, however, this is not the case, also because sometimes dialect speakers consider a written dialect name to be unsuitable for the public sphere and would probably even feel ashamed by seeing their intimate name, dialect name, in the public sphere, for instance, on town signs. It is also a fact that the ability to read dialect, the written form of the dialect, in its specific orthography is not very widespread, it's not very popular. Declaring the names of a global trade language the norm, instead of names in a national standard language, is not a realistic option either, as long as nations are the most powerful global players and languages and alphabets with their place names are so symbolic for national identity. Even if English proceeds in its status as a dominant trade language, this does not have to mean that English names, if they exist for a feature, will become the standard. Just as English as a trade language with the specific functions of this language category will continue to supplement the local standard languages in their own functions, and each of these two categories would have its dominant functional sphere, so would it be with place names in these languages. In their additional function as international names, English exonyms will only become standardized for certain international purposes like navigation, for instance, or aviation. What cannot be denied, however, is that standardization means elevating one name version for a feature over the usually many others and promoting its use, while other versions are regarded as less useful, less prestigious perhaps also, and therefore are in danger to fall into oblivion. It is like elevating in a multilingual society only one language to the rank of an official language, out of many languages to elevate one to the rank of the official language. So this means elevating this language over the others. This means that standardization works against the wealth of culture, expressing itself also in the wealth of place names, which is a fact that has also in Angegen fully been recognized only more recently, and results in a tension that remains at least to be mitigated. And this is my last word, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to receive questions. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much for your presentation. Your speech was very nice, and we have several problems with standardizations and exonymies and endonyms in our thesaurus. It was very important in your presentation, and I'd like to thank you so much for this opening speech for our Sipat. Nesse momento, eu gostaria
At this time, I would like to thank all of you for your presence, all of the guests, and all of you who are here with us. And let us close our opening ceremony now. We would like to invite you all to participate in the presentations that will start in our YouTube channel. So thank you once again. Thank you very much for your presence. And this opening ceremony will be available to you, and also the presentations that we had here, they will all be available in our website. It was wonderful. It was truly great. It was very nice to hear from all of you and to have you all here. And we're very sorry that we are in a virtual meeting, but we want our third Sipat in 2 years' time. If God helps us, we hope to have you all in person, so that we can share our experiences together as we have always done. So thank you very much for your presence. Once again, thank you everyone who's participating and who will participate with us. And at this time, then I will declare our opening ceremony over. Thank you very much.